purposes, so it's a challenge because I feel like I can play with a microphone, but I actually can't. So anyway, welcome everyone. Thrilled to have you. Today's conversation, as I'm sure all of you know, is part of our Image Makers for America in Pursuit of National Identity exhibition, currently on view at the Couse-Sharp Historic Site, now through November 13th. So if any of you have not seen it, please take the time. And if any of your 600 friends on social media have not seen it, make sure that they see it. So the panel discussion is Taos Society of Artists in Pursuit of a National Identity. I would first like to introduce our panelists. Mr. Michael Grauer, who is a consultant, guest curator, and scholarly researcher, writer, and presenter, but to name a few. And then Alicia Romero, PhD, head curator, curator of history at the Albuquerque Museum. And last but not least, Mr. Jonathan Warm Day Cumming, artist and writer from Taos Pueblo. Welcome, everyone. Yeah. And I should probably introduce myself. Davison Packard, executive director and curator at the Couse-Sharp Historic Site. So thrilled to have you all here today. I want to quickly give a big shout out to our underwriters of the exhibition, John and Sarah Riddick. We're thrilled. And our hosts, our sponsor, and our lodging partner, Hotel Willa. We love having these events here. This is just such a warm, fuzzy space to have these kind of conversations. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for their support. So, I'm going to play dual role of moderator and sometimes panelist. I would like to just introduce our discussion, and then I really want to largely hand it over to our esteemed colleagues here. So as most of you know, in 1915, 6 individuals here in Taos created something called the Taos Society of Artists. And it's important to understand the context of that period, who New Mexico was, where they were coming from, and who we were as a nation. Right? In 1915, the United States was still a relatively young nation on the world scene, and we were still under the shadow of Europe culturally. And these were artists that studied back east and studied in Europe. And so they're in coffee shops talking about the identity of America, the direction of American art. How do we create a new identity? What is that? And they, like many of us, grew up with that mythic narrative of the American West. It's just ours was formed by John Wayne, John Ford, Sergio Leone, Clint Eastwood, and theirs was formed by, Kit Carson's dime novels of dubious accuracy, and Buffalo Bill's Traveling Roadshow. But that same lure of that mythic American West is what brought them to Taos. But interestingly, they discovered something far more complex, far more profound, far more spiritual, if you will, here in Taos. As a result, the group eventually grew to 19 individuals here in Taos and Santa Fe, who showed group works across the nation, who wrote for illustrated magazines, who forever really reimagined not only the American West, but also the American identity in the process. Those 6 that initially created the Taos Society of Artists, their express goal was to create authentically American art. So it's even now to imagine at their most romanticized, like Couse-Sharp, for example, that was still progressive in its day. Because in 1915, right, we had, as a nation, had been waging a war of active genocide and relocation for well over some 150 years. And this was the height of the reservation period. We forget at the beginning of the 20th century, we were taking children from their homes and putting them in boarding schools across the country. The mantra of the Bureau of Indian Affairs was, kill the Indian, save the man. That was the parlance of the day. Scientists were still arguing over the intellectual capacity of Native Americans or First Americans. So against that backdrop, that was a very different world. And at the same time, in 1915, America is now embroiled in the World War. We just achieved statehood in 1912. It was debated on the Senate floor the merits of bringing a state with questionable, exploitable resources and a population of dark-skinned and primarily Catholic people into our Christian nation. So these are fascinating times. In some ways, we're still having that conversation as a nation about our identity and what that means to be American. So we thought it timely to have a conversation about what is the humanities impact of the Taos Society of Artists in 1915. What is it today? Why is that still an important conversation? So that's why we have invited our friends Michael, Alicia, and Jonathan to have a conversation about just that. And I'm just going to leave the room. Glad you all came. Thanks. See you. So who would like to start?
Well, I think by the time I put this talk, you pretty much covered everything.
Yeah.
But, you know, coming from the Pueblo, as an artist, I'm still learning. And a lot of things are still being covered. My family is deeply into the arts.
Can you speak up, Jonathan? Because we're not actually live. This is just for recording purposes. So we have to use our natural voices to project.
My family was deep into the arts here. Well, my grandparents most were artists here in Taos. My own mom became an artist too, following in their footsteps. But this is a very interesting location for that. And a lot of things happened during that time to the Native people. And I'll focus on the Pueblo here, Taos Pueblo. And I'll always say, we were farmers, hunters and gatherers. My family did so. I remember as a little kid, accompanying my family down to the, on the mesa there, we had cattle. We kept following around, herding cattle. And afterwards, we had fields near the Pueblo where we had alfalfa and wheat. I still remember that as a kid. But I really, at that time, really didn't know to what extent my family participated in the arts. Only after I started doing paintings that I tried to get documentation on my mom's work, I started learning about all this stuff. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'll come back on what it takes.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I would say we haven't figured it out yet. Right? I mean, more than 100 years later, we haven't figured it out yet, and I don't know that we ever will. As a historian, I'm sure I'm in a room of the company, many historians. There's so much more that we learn, I think, with each passing generation, more archives that are shared, right? More folks that are passing away, or unfortunately, I'll say, more attics or basements, maybe not in New Mexico, but more areas where we're finding things. And that helped us tell a little bit more pieces of the story, right? Give us a few more pieces of that puzzle. So my family, my family's from Santa Cruz de la Cañada, on kind of both sides, but also from Arroyo de Agua, near Albuquerque, near Coyote, near Cañones. Like I started with Albuquerque, it kind of gets smaller. And we were dealing with a different beast in that area, right? Kind of somebody else, also from a different part of this country, from the East Coast, claiming the region for her own, claiming Bellabnad for her own, while my family were sheep herders. right, we're living off of the land as many of the families here, native and common people were. And so that's the context in which I look at some of these artists and their impact is where were the Mexicanos and the Mexicanas existing at that time as well. Existing, coexisting, peacefully, violently, in many ways with our Native American neighbors as well, right? So then we got another contingent coming in, putting their own spin on things, and I think interpreting a very historic, fraught relationship and using it in their own way to communicate to a different audience. They were not communicating to my family. Okay, next.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we gotta apologize for wearing my hat in the house, you ladies. That's not appropriate to get that, but this is my Buck Dutton hat, and since I've been working on Buck Dutton since 1989, I gotta represent Willa because he's usually the one who gets forgotten about in the TSA. Yeah, I know I'm not a homer. But nevertheless, hope you forgive me for wearing the hat in the house. I was thinking this morning that just a week ago today, I was giving a lecture on the Santa Fe Trail in Arrow Rock, Missouri, which is one of the starting places just northwest of Franklin, Missouri, the initial starting place. We went back now in 1821. And here I am at the other end of the Santa Fe Trail a week later. Took a lot longer to do it back in the day, of course, to get out here, but the Santa Fe Trail was the first exposure to northern New Mexico for most people in what they called the States. That part of Missouri was the States, that was the United States, it kind of ended there. Not a lot of settlement in western Missouri and so on, but it's somewhat ironic that we're talking here 100 years before the Taos Society of Artists is founded. An international trade route is open. And of course, there's an exploration of that through the 1790s. Although in somewhat in defiance of Spanish law that you could only trade with Spain, there were forays to try to find a trade route to the United States through agents of the Spanish government. And this was the northernmost part of New Spain, right here. But at the same time, when those Spanish explorers came here, they found out, oh, by the way, there are people already here. What a surprise. And so that exposure to northern New Mexico and Taos in particular was brand new to Americans as they saw themselves then. Because remember, this was part of Mexico at that time, 1821, and Mexico just gained its independence from Spain, lasted for another 25 years, and then became part of the U.S. And I think Davison said this already, New Mexico becomes a state in 1912, a couple of years before the TSA is founded. All these things play a role in the journey of discovery for the TSA. And in 1915, when they got together, there were all kinds of things, not just centered here in northern New Mexico, but worldwide, that were affecting spiritual purity. And I believe that these artists came here looking for purity. And what they found was what they interpreted as a pure form of spirituality in relationship to the land, by not only the Puebloan peoples, but also by the Hispanic peoples who were here as well. They saw a kinship that they felt had been lost in the States and certainly in Europe. Degradation, in fact. And so, obviously it was idealistic, but nevertheless, I believe they came from a good place. I want to think good of other people. And I believe they came here, and Jonathan and I were talking about this before we started. I believe they saw it, as Buck Dunn says, the Taos Indians are the finest types that I've ever seen. And he was all over the West, more so than the other guys, frankly, from Montana to Old Mexico. And he'd seen and worked with multiple native tribes. Likewise, he said similar things about the Hispanic population here too. And he saw that as most people that came here to northern New Mexico as an extension of Spain, not Mexico. And there was a distinction at that time. And frankly, in many minds, there still is. And so I think from where they came from, it was a journey of discovery. And like Jonathan was alluding to, it's still a journey of discovery for him as a working artist. Whatever artists are in here, you're still discovering. Every time you wake up, it's a new day, isn't it? It's not yesterday. Today's a new day. You're a new you. You got a little bit of your old self, but it's a new you. And I think that's how they approached it. They saw it as a pure place with pure cultures, and they were trying to capture it. And Davison alluded to this. In their mission statement for the Taos Society of Artists, education is the bottom line. It's not selling paintings. It's education about this amazing place. And I just want to thank you, Taos Annuals, for here. This is my 40th anniversary this summer to start coming to Taos, New Mexico. You have changed me. This place has changed me. And I'm a better human being because I get to come to Taos. You allowed me to come here. And I believe I think they saw it as a privilege. I really do. It was a gift. Not all of them came to stay initially, but they couldn't not stay, if that makes sense. I preached too long, I'm going to stop.
Michael brings up a couple things I'd like to just elaborate on contextually. One of them is that we have to acknowledge that this is also the height of the arts and crafts movement, right? So these artists are living in eastern cities, they're responding to the Industrial Revolution, and there is this idealism that's sweeping not just the nation, but the world, of this return to a simpler craft-oriented, coexistence with nature that Native America and Northern New Mexico and Nuevo Mexicano communities squarely fit into. So they're bringing this vision of a return to something more beautiful, and they come with a naivete to Taos in Northern New Mexico because they, like most Americans, have no concept of this complex history. And that's something else is we forget how much deep history there is out west prior to 1821, the opening of the Santa Fe Trail, and certainly prior to 1847, Kearney's Army of the West. And that Taos Pueblo was arguably the most important trade center in what is now the American West for hundreds of years. And we forget that Taos was the edge of empire for the Mesoamerican world, and then it was the edge of empire for the Spanish world. We've always been this frontier area, and that has impacted our identity today. And this is what the artists are learning along the way. I mean, poor Bert Phillips, when he arrives in 1898, he has no idea where he's landed. He refuses to doff his cap during a religious procession on the plaza and basically starts a race riot, gets thrown in jail and nearly killed, and gets the sheriff killed. 2 weeks later, he's taking Spanish lessons. So, that was a steep learning curve for these guys. And what's fascinating is that originally they thought they were creating a summer art colony, a la Barbizon. But ultimately, the majority of the artists live here, become embedded in the community, and their work becomes far more profound because of the relationships that they build. And something that we were talking about earlier was, that was a very different world where Taos was very small, it was remote, even though it was a very multicultural crossroads. We needed each other in different ways than we do today. While smartphones and automobiles and the internet have so connected us in meaningful ways, we don't need each other anymore, it's optional. But in the Taos of 100+ years ago, we needed all of our community members. And that meant you had to learn from each other and you had to find ways to work together. And I think we still see that evidence today in Taos. I like to talk about when Sue and I first arrived here, and we're in the checkout line with Smith's and someone cracks a joke and somebody else jumps in, and I was like, wow, we are not in Kansas anymore. No offense, Kansas, just reference to the menu, But that is significant because that history continues today, and we still see it in Taos, and it's all around us if we take the time to acknowledge it and step into that.
I think it's also important to point out in art historical terms that art colonies sprung up. Jenny Couse wrote about this. Art colonies sprung up all around the United States as artists were seeking escape from urban places that were dirty, full of air pollution, there was lung disease run rampant. I always thought that's a perfect master's thesis topic for PhD is lung disease and art in the American West. I think that's critical, but they spring up in Santa Barbara, Woodstock, New York, Brown County, Indiana. They're all over the place in the 1890s and early 1900s. So it was to seek the new, seek the pure, and this is the one that lasted, frankly, is the one here in Taos, New Mexico. So we need to keep that context, I think.
I think one other thing that I like to keep in mind as well, in understanding these artists, and I don't know all of their biographies, really exactly what they were escaping, so to speak, but to put it into greater United States context, they were also dealing with a different kind of immigration system, very exclusionary immigration system. So we think of them moving from the the East Coast, right? And maybe from the West Coast being confronted with Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, the Gentleman's Agreement, which excluded Japanese immigration as well. So people are feeling closed in, perhaps. Why do we have exclusionary immigration practices? Is people are feeling a little bit xenophobic. And maybe those populations and those communities were a little bit more prevalent on the coasts and seeking some kind of authentic New Mexican, because we have newer populations coming to the shores and setting up businesses. So, you know, just whatever kind of baggage they were coming with, whatever they were seeking out, because they were trying to leave congested tenements, right? They're trying to seek some sort of respite from their lung conditions and tuberculosis, right? The tubers and that kind of thing. So just, we can't ever think of something as just like, I came in on the railroad and all's good, and I came to Taos and, you know, whatever, and I set up shop. It's, what were they fleeing?
Yes.
And then
What
what
were
were
those
those
drivers?
what were those drivers? What were those push and pull factors?
No, good point.
You know, the Taos Society of Artists took its cue from an outfit called the Society of Western Artists, which sounds like, well, they should be in the West. Well, they were all in Ohio, or they were in Indiana, or they were in Michigan. And basically, Chicago was the base for the Society of Western Artists. It was always a magnet, a pull to go west, because that's where all the cool stuff is, right? There was also a society of men who came to the West, and they had exhibitions around the country. So that pull, that motivating factor was also there. It's aesthetic, and also that journey of discovery. Hey, I want to go see what everybody's talking about. You know, and that started quite early on, but at the same time, there are artistic communities that are already here too. And that we can't not acknowledge that, and remember that's part of the great tapestry of art making. And those are some of the other threads and the patches on the quilt that there were native traditions here, spinal art making traditions here as well. And those become part of that whole cloth weaving of art making in the US and in the Americas and in the world.
There's something that I found out gradually through my own art and stuff, that while these other people were coming into our valley here, the Valley of Taos, our people were forced to leave to some degree. Case in point, our grandfather left for work to Nashville, Tennessee, where the DuPont engineering factory was to make red powder. And of course, the Santa Fe Union School had just been created. So the children were being taken, and our elders were moving to the farming fields of southern Colorado, places like that. So we had these cool and other directions too. Not every one of us could pose with these artists. So our parents and our grandparents had to go out there and find a living, earn wages. So that's what I found out, that there were different job opportunities that they had to find and leave as well.
Yeah, I don't think we can emphasize enough how much change was happening during that period. You know, the artists arrived in the late 1890s, and by 1920s, we have, you know, automobiles and, you know, gas stations on the corner. In 1890s, this was burro, horse, stage-driven world. So, I mean, everyone is responding to this quickly changing social, political, economic advance that is just moving at a rapid rate. And of course, the loss of Blue Lake was enormous to Taos Pueblo. That changed everything. They were no longer in control of their natural resources and their economy. So all of that's happening simultaneously. You know, it's hard for us you know, we think about this rapid change with, you know, technology and AI, and yeah, it's frightening, but very different. It's under the skin change, but this rapid change that was happening at the turn of the last century was a physical thing that it was moving people. It was changing people's lives very quickly. And yeah, I think it's really hard for us to imagine what that was like. And these artists were coming with money, even though these were struggling artists, you know, coming from back east that had chosen an uncertain career. And the majority of these artists were, brought themselves up from their bootstraps and put themselves through art school. Still, the disparity between the people and the economy in northern New Mexico was significant. They could arrive and buy property. They could afford to pay homes. So, you know, we can't forget that while they came with the greatest intention, or certainly good intentions, inherently there was a uneven power structure that was at work all the time.
Yeah.
So in 1922, the TSA starts a fraction. And I don't know if the timing of that with the Mercer bill and the threats to Pueblo land ownerships and so on played a role, but I really should have been prohibition. But that's a pretty critical thing that happens right there. Put in play by Anglo lawmakers. I'd like to hear more about that. Maybe that's the other too, about the Mercer bill, what that really meant, what the threats it was to Pueblo lands, and then of course, moving Hispanic people from those lands for decades, centuries, being pushed off. That's a pretty threatening thing that happens in 1922. And artists played a role in that too.
They played a significant role. You know, legislators were trying to sneak that through, and that was going to dispossess millions of people of land in New Mexico. So yeah, that was more than significant. And you know, the artists were out and out advocates of Native rights and sovereignty, both through their work, through lobbying. And something we haven't talked about that's in the exhibition is the reach that they had because of the work that they were doing through the magazines and through frankly, their patrons. Folks like J.D. Rockefeller become friends with the Taos artists. So they now have access to, you know, to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and to politicians, and that was significant during that period, from the Mercer bill to the return of Blue Lake. That is always occurring throughout all of the Taos artists. Some are more outspoken, like Blumenschein and Walter Rutherford, but folks like Henry Sharp were writing letters all the time. And then Couse, you can even look at, you know, Couse as the most romanticized of all the Taos artists. And, you know, he's in some ways a great poster child because, you know, he's creating these really idealized visions of Native America that are this fascinating combination of Greco-Roman sculpture and academic European trained art traditions meet the Pueblo world. And even that, at its most romanticized, was still progressive compared to most depictions of Native people up to that period. And the fact that he's the most commercially successful, his images were seen by more Americans than any other probably single artist in America during that period. So, but that also comes with a whole other layer of baggage, what I like to call the Couse paradox, is he's simultaneously promoting this romanticized vision of the noble savage. Right? For 100 years, Americans have been doing an amazing job of using Native America to sell products, whether it's baking soda, or lanolin, or snake oil, or motorcycles, while simultaneously committing acts of genocide and active removal, something we've always been very good at advertising. So yeah, all that's happening. That is challenging, and yet Couse is all that. You know, his goal was to present the people of Taos Pueblo at their most beautiful. That was it, you know, and that's really what he's guilty of. However, you know, great intentions
it's complicated. There are repercussions. There are repercussions that continue today. And so that's part of what we want to talk about is, what is that? How do we move through it? It's something New Mexico, I think, has done a good job. Someone that's an outsider to New Mexico, I'm always amazed at how complicated, contested, and how challenging our history is, but yet we move through it as New Mexicans, and largely we're able to talk about it and acknowledge that challenge, but also it's a shared history. And that's something I'm always thinking about is, well, as soon as we see stuff as other, we're no longer taking responsibility and we're not moving through it. When we see it as part of our shared American tapestry, we can own that history. And that's a good thing, because it enables us to learn from it and move through it. Otherwise, we stay in this whirlpool that is not really advancing us as a people, as a nation.
There's one thing that you mentioned there that, these artists are not given that much credit for having the cause. But a lot of focus is put on the lawyers, the politicians, but not enough for the artists. And I, myself, come across that as an artist at the Pueblo. We're always walking that fine line. Do the history of my art, people question the images that I draw. I don't understand why, much credit has to be given to the artists at that time. And they were caught, they struggled. Much more credit is given to the politicians and the lawyers.
Yeah, did everyone hear Jonathan's comment?
No.
So Jonathan was saying that, at the Pueblo, the artists don't generally get the credit for the work that they did during that period. And then usually it's the lawyers and the politicians that get the credit. And so he was wondering, why is that? Is that because we like to keep everybody in a neat box because it keeps our world organized and we can make sense of it, and artists should stay in the artist lane and politicians stay in the politician lane? I don't know, but that's a good question. It tells us that we need more. It tells us we need more scholarship on that, and it just means we need, it makes the work that we do all the more important because we need to get these stories out because these stories actually unite us more than they divide us.
I will say, to the extent that the art of the TSA was political, but sitting in this incredible gallery with this really beautiful artwork around us, and if you don't think that art is political,
Right.
you have a different kind of advantage than the rest of us do. And to the extent that they thought that what they were doing was going to help the cause, then that's great, right? I mean, they did or they didn't, right? Art for art's sake.
Did they?
Did they?
How much?
Yeah.
Is a question we may never be able to answer. But it's a good question. And we're surrounded by D.C. Allen's work. If you don't know D.C. Allen, he's curator at the Tia Collection in Santa Fe, fabulous artist. It could not be a better backdrop, again, for a conversation here at Couse-Sharp. But no matter how hard you try, our artwork can and is political. And no doubt their artwork was political during its day, whether they intended it to be. Like Couse would have never thought his work was probably real political. He was just doing his darndest to make beautiful images of a beautiful culture. But they were political at the time, and they're political now.
I'd like to think that they were thinking about the person bill, about the Dawes Act. I would like to think that they're thinking of where's the role of the United States when they enter in World War I in 1917? What's the role of the United States in the 1920s? More fully, I would like to think that they're thinking about these things, reading them in the people around in their communications to different parts of the country or different parts of the world, and reflecting on those themes in some of their art, right? They may not go out and make something like what we see in walls around us, but perhaps in their way, we can only imagine
Well, the good thing is there has been a fair amount of scholarship documenting their work both through individual pieces and through lobbying and editorial and writing in magazines. So we do have a pretty good body there, which is nice. But I think there's a lot more to be done. Getting that out and really telling more of that story, both the artists in Taos and Santa Fe. Returning to something Michael said earlier, the first clause in the Taos Society of Artists Charter was the society is created for educational purposes. The second was that the society is created to promote the native arts. And during that period, when people said native, they meant native to Nuevo Mexico. So they meant both indigenous and Hispanic. And that's something I've always taken to heart as actually pretty compelling in 1915. That means the artists were very self-aware of the work that they were doing and their reach. That by depicting native art in their work, they were helping to engender an art economy. And that's important because it's 10 years later that the Indian art market is formed. So, the artists were also very involved with that. And as I like to remind people, there is nowhere in the United States that A, has the breadth and continuum of art as the American Southwest has, but most importantly, northern New Mexico has, going back thousands of years with all the layers that we have. And then there's no other, certainly, indigenous or possibly Hispano art economies like northern New Mexico has. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I know a lot of artists that make a good living telling their cultural stories. And that's significant because that is not the case in most of the United States. So that's something else that it's nice to remind ourselves that art economy has been doing very well for a very long time. And New Mexico is one of the few states, and partly it's probably thanks to the Santa Fe Railway and Frank Simpson and Fred Harvey, but we have promoted art and culture for well over 100 years. Arizona is still promoting golf and sunshine. And, I love Arizona, don't get me wrong. But New Mexico at least understood, has always understood, that actually that art and culture is pivotal to who we are, even if it was economically motivated.
Well, I mean, it's selling the local example.
Yeah, yes,
This is the
yeah.
MRV. We're
Yes.
gonna bring populations on the Santa Fe Railway and package local cultures and communities in a way that will be palatable perhaps to travelers moving west, first by train and then by car. Sorry, I just lived in like Route 66 land, being in Albuquerque, but this is, we're still seeing I don't know if it's the fruits of that labor, but we're still seeing the ripple effects of some of these late 19th century, early 20th century attempts to make what Native American looks like for an outsider, what a Spanish person looks like to an outsider to New Mexico.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to that commodification, right? It's us marketing to ourselves that Americans are so good at, as well as marketing to foreigners.
Spanish market, of course, has its own baggage in the Spanish Colonial Art Society as part of this conversation, but it's always been curious to me, or I've always been interested in this, is when the Indian curio and the Spanish curio suddenly transfers to a fine art object. You have your Indian room, your Spanish room, Rockefeller had his Indian room and so on. And then suddenly, the blanket is no longer on the floor, it's hanging on the wall. It's gone from being a saddle blanket to a tapestry. Now, how does that happen? It's the same thing. So when does that, and how does that transfer occur? Santero's work is this interesting thing about this exotic religion that's practiced in New Mexico, and suddenly now it's a sculpture, a painted sculpture. The Taos is no longer just a religious painting, it's a beautiful example of Spanish colonial art making. So how does that happen? Who's driving that? I know Harvey's a part of the Indian detours and Santa Fe Railway is a big part of that. At the same time, there are scholars who are involved too, artists as well, not just say, but preserve and reinterpret It's a reinterpretation. What's that? It's a change of how we see that. You can't walk on the satellite anymore because you're walking on a work of art. You gotta hang it on the wall, and you don't touch it unless you have white gloves. I mean, it was, at one time, it was on the back of a horse. You understand what I mean? I mean, how did that occur?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question in itself, and, obviously it happens over time.
Yes.
But, in native pottery, I mean, we can look at Nampeyo Ohano. She's the first native artist to sign her work, and that's a watershed moment in the native artwork. Not only does it move from, a useful utilitarian craft by Anglo standards to fine art, and it's done at the encouragement of both the trading post and the anthropologists that are out at Hillary. But it's also, almost more importantly, it changes Pueblo society forever, because the Pueblos are by design socialist economies, where the we is more important than the me. But of course, Anglos and capitalism are great at bringing the me to the party. So that changes everything. That moment she signs that piece of pottery is really when that change begins. So, there's major repercussions for every one of those things that seem great at the time, but greatly affects these individual cultures over time.
And at the same time, we have two artists at Taos Pueblo, Albert Lujan and Albert looking over painting as they were trained by TSA artists. Your American tradition, they're not painting like Indians should. Right? They're painting this way and selling them as souvenirs for the most part. And yet, as I understand it, there's some ostracization that's going on. You're not painting like we paint, you're painting like how they paint. Wait a minute, the we and they thing, push and pull, that plays a role as well, and it happens in the Hispanic community as well. These traditions that came from Spain to Mexico and then up into the frontera. Is that how we paint here? No, I don't know. Those people who are practicing that, are they being traitors? Are they turning their back on the culture? Those are all interesting questions that need to be explored. Smart people that need to explore.
But yeah, keep a mural to canvas. I mean, right, that's a big leap, very quickly.
One thing that I always like to comment, even way before the coming of the Anglo artists to this valley, Pueblo people, ancient people, were artists already. Take a look at the etchings that surround us, and also the pottery that we mentioned. I accidentally bumped into a book when I was at the library one day, and some abstract artist was commenting on how he had done his work because of Pueblo pottery. And these were well-known abstract artists painting in the East that had copied the work of potters. So that's how far back our art goes to influence the artists. So it's not just coming of the present art. We've been doing art for a long time here in this valley.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking at least 10,000 years of artistic tradition in Taos Valley alone. And yeah, I would be the first to champion that American modernism does not begin in 1913. But actually begins with Pueblo textiles, basketry, and pottery. If you look at an 1880 Zuni water jar, you cannot tell me that that is not any more avant-garde, minimalist, reduced to its absolute most beautiful symbolism and meaning, far exceeding anything that was being done in Europe and America after that.
Well, those artists who came here were trying to tap into it. They saw that, absolutely. This is the modernism we're trying to incorporate into our own work. Morrison Hart is one of the best examples of that. And it was like, can't you see this? We want you to see this. And so we want you to see this through the exhibitions of our work that we're painting here in Taos or in Santa Fe or wherever that is. That was their conduit. And if it was a popular magazine, and do see the wonderful hallway exhibition that accompanies the TSA show at the Couse-Sharp Site. It's really a beautiful thing to talk about what were the conduits, what were the ways to communicate these images. And the artists, these TSA artists and others were looking for any way they could share this amazing place. Today, it feels cheap. Well, it wasn't cheap in those days. You know, all you gotta do is pick up your phone. I don't have to pick up my phone, a flip phone. So y'all look at your phone and you can be anywhere, you really can. You're just fooling yourselves. But in those days, it was paper, it was printed images. Sometimes not terribly well printed and certainly not with any lucidity. But at the same time, that was a conduit. And they looked for conduits, how to share. That's what I believe. Okay, and Terminator was a documentary, by the way. Be careful with that AI stuff.
Yeah, it is coming for us all.
It is.
It's okay, ask Lord, he'll get us first. We can only hope. Okay, I don't want to end on that note, but no, I want to thank our panelists for a really fun conversation. But I want to open it up to questions from you all. I know we have a very engaged and informed audience.
Just one brief comment. In the 1960s, I met a woman who bought a bowl from Maria, a black bowl, and she tossed salads in this bowl for about 20 years until she found out what it would cost to replace the bowl.
Very, very common, unfortunately. Plenty of those have turned into lamps and all kinds of, drill a hole right in the flower.
Yep, great for flowers, filled with water.
Flowers.
But, you know, that Pueblo pottery is pretty sturdy, despite what museum curator said. Anyone else?
Thank you all so much. I have a question for Alicia and for Jonathan. I was wondering if you all could comment on the changes that you've seen in perceptions of Southwest art culture, like, say, in the last 20 years.
There's a definite change, you know, but it's to be expected, you know. We influence the younger generation, and they will influence their generation. I love it. Take a look around.
Yeah.
They're taking it in a whole different direction.
Yeah, I think for Nuevo Mexicano, Mexicanos here in New Mexico, let's say, there's kind of a pull to remain traditional, right? For those of you who enjoy going to Santa Fe in July, or I guess next weekend or the weekend after, the Spanish market. So the Spanish market and then the contemporary market, and people who feel like they need to maintain these traditional ways of santo making, which themselves are very evolutionary from when that started to happen here when Spanish speaking people came. And a lot of these artists, were accused of, well, you're not doing it the right way, right? You're not doing it the way that so-and-so, they can't even name any of these santeros, but you're not doing it the way that I've seen it done before. This is how you paint San Francisco, right? And if you do innovation, you're really not being true to who you are as Nuevo Mexicano people. And I think this is a lasting legacy of even the WPA, for example, where outside artists were going to teach local communities how to do their own art, right? How to revive Spanish Colonial Art Society. I mean, and this is what happens. Can you be an artist from a certain cultural community and do something that has nothing to do with, or does it have the hallmarks, let's say, of the community that you come from? Yes and no. I mean, that's not a question that anybody, I don't know if anybody grapples with on the day-to-day, but I think there's a lot of great artists that are challenging some of these stereotypical notions of what it means to be a New Mexican or Nuevo Mexicano artist, for example, in New Mexico or in the Southwest, but I think they get a lot of flack for that too.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, say that is definitely an ongoing conversation in all art forms here in New Mexico for all artists. I'm sure Susan Falwell can speak to that. And I think that's never going to go away. Actually, it's kind of a healthy debate because we're always skating where, well, what is historically traditional? But, the reality is that all the culture, humans evolve over time, and we're always addressing as artists that change in order to be around us and social issues. So we're always going to have that healthy debate and dialogue, even if it's sometimes challenging. It can also inspire artists to respond to that.
Well, even these TSA artists, right, speaking of seeking out the authentic and seeking out the pure, when we know within our own communities that we evolve over time, right? So they're coming in at a point where they're looking at a moment in time
Yeah.
and wanting people or seeing people in a certain moment. Can they change? Are they allowed to change?
Yeah, I mean, again, returning to Couse, he's projecting this, ethnographic stasis in a way that is just this pure and beautiful moment. That never changes throughout his career. It's based on the lived reality here in Taos and at the Pueblo, but he's forever throughout his career capturing this moment in time that is rapidly changing around him, and he's very aware of that. Now, a lot of the other artists are capturing everyday life in Taos. It isn't that all of them are purely as romantic as Couse. So we have that throughout the spectrum of the artist.
Thank you. What a great conversation. All of this came at a cost to people, to communities. And I'm curious if you can go to what your organization is doing to meet that cost, and maybe if any of you are doing anything to meet the cost of what I would say is exploitation of the community in the name of art, and that exploitation was an industrialized expression of culture and life. And the consequences of that here 100 years later are real. And I'll just say it, Taos is experiencing gentrification like it hasn't, maybe since the fur trappers showed up. So there's a cost. How do we meet that cost now?
Very good question.
So yeah, the artists were aware during their lifetime that their work was affecting their community and their economy. The Couse family purchases the 19 acres that are known as the Couse pasture to preserve the rural integrity of Taos in the 1920s. So they were very aware that they were affecting our community. What is our organization doing to address that cost? I mean, for us, the focus is really on how do we generate education and awareness in our community about our shared history. What I hear from a lot of parents in Taos is there's no jobs for our children in Taos. They have to go away. This is entirely a service economy that we could say is a result of, the marketing of Taos in northern New Mexico. And, internally I counter, well, if our children in Taos grew up knowing the complexity and the import of Taos' story, its cultural history, its shared history, its identity, and why Taos still has national import, I believe that's economic opportunity. I firmly believe that our youth should, leave Taos, get skills, experience life outside of northern New Mexico, but bring those skills back to better our community and leverage that identity in our own community. So that's kind of been our focus is how do we build Taos from within by better knowing its own shared history and identity and not falling into the trap of the three-legged stool of New Mexico. It's Anglo, it's Hispano, and it's just indigenous. Like, our story is way more complex than that. If we look back historically, we were far more connected in the 16, 17, 1800s in ways that we're not necessarily connected today. But it is a really good question. It's a really good question. It's something that we strive with today. One example, we just purchased the Giving houses back to create affordable housing in the historic district. I'm tired of people talking about the lack of affordable housing. We've reached out to every partner we could in New Mexico. To help with funding, we have gotten nowhere. So we just fully went after private funding
to make that happen, because everyone's talking about it, but we're not addressing that as a community on the level that we should. And that is a threat to the Couse-Sharp Historic Site, because we're threatened with losing partnerships that we created with academic institutions across the country, because we're supposed to provide safe, affordable housing. And we can't do that anymore. So I like to think that Couse-Sharp Historic Site is putting its money where its mouth is, investing in our community and addressing that so that we can move forward as a healthy community, better know ourselves, and create more economic opportunity within our community. Anyone else would like to address that question?
The lady back there mentioned exploitation, I believe. I always think about that with every painting I do, especially coming from Brooklyn's history and upholding its beliefs. Constantly there. I've heard it before. Like with the image, you know, in the beginning, I was getting some comments from tribal members about that. It was hard for me to keep going. But that's who I am. I'm an artist. That's who I express myself.
I think it's a bigger human story, frankly. This is just one chapter. It's the newest chapter. It's been happening since there have been humans. It's just what happens. It sucks sometimes, and it's hurtful sometimes. Pain and destruction happens, but it's what humans do to other humans, sadly. But it is part of it, and it's been cyclical. Bob Gunn was interviewed 100 years ago for American Magazine of Art, and he's quoted as saying, "The West is past, where's the pity?" I'm going to hang down a bit of an unadulterated real thing, and I'm going to do it pronto. Because he saw what he thought was the West was going away. 100 years before that, George Gatlin said the same thing. I'm going to be the historian of the American Aborigine. Before that, there was a Taos grandfather who was saying to his grandson or granddaughter, these are the traditional stories, say them. And likewise in Spain or wherever you look back, that's always been happening, an attempt to preserve for a time something of that moment. And that's the only way. So to continue to make that part of the tapestry of human history, that's what I think. So what Dunn eventually evolved into a way of creating, if you look at some of his latest paintings, they're like little hermetically sealed dioramas in the museum. They even have stage lighting. And they're artificially lit. And he wants you to know, this is an artificial creation of my own interpretation. This isn't the truth, but it's my truth. This is how I saw it. This is how I experienced it. And he saw the evolution from the trappers who had become good trappers. You know, things change and things evolve. You had to find a new skill set or use the old skills in a new way. You know, so it is part of a bigger human story. And I think when we know better, we do better. I believe that. And that's a really critical thing to keep in mind. When we know better, we do better.
It's a complex question, kind of like, I don't know if I lost the crux of what you were asking, but I think I don't want to be the spokesperson for my community, but I'm up here, right? So, I think for many people like me from northern New Mexico and kind of grappling with people interpreting our stories for us, I'm in the role that I'm in because I wanted to be able to do that, right? Because I have a responsibility for my community to be able to talk about our history in a way that, not that I feel is correct, but is another way of telling that story, right? So at my museum, can't speak on the activities of Couse-Sharp, but I really do try to mentor students who would never have thought that they could have a career in the museum field that are, you know, minorities or from other disenfranchised communities to try to diversify that field. That also comes with just educating ourselves about our own culture and community where, you know, my mom's generation and grandparents were, I'm sure many of you have heard this story before, under very harsh assimilationist practices, very much like the not as severe as Native American communities, but being, the Spanish beaten out of them, right? So there's this active reclamation of our own language, right? And traditions and practices so that we're not ashamed of speaking Spanish, where we're not ashamed of being called Mexican, that's not a dirty word, right? And all this takes time, but it's this reclamation project that I see happening in my community too. And sometimes that means, necessarily like, it's not the land back movement, not by any means, but it's just making a stake, right? Playing part of whatever we can.
I didn't answer the institutional part, because I don't work for an institution right now, but Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art did an exhibition a couple years ago called Knowing the West, and it was looking at the West in different ways. If you don't have that publication, you really should acquire that for your own libraries. I hope you saw the exhibition, because it was pretty thought-provoking. I mean, there were installation techniques that took things out of the way you normally saw things. And a lot of my work over my career is in scholarship, specifically on women artists and depictions of women. Now, some of you might say, well, what in the world is a man doing in that realm? I get that all the time, actually. But, you know, if you're not going to step up, then I'm going to step up. It's simple as that. You know, so, you know, come on in, the water's fine. I would say.
I would just add that I think we're in a fascinating moment, you know, thinking about how history is reinterpreted. And, you know, we have this, we're in a cultural moment where we have erasure happening all across the country. But art historians are having very different conversations than we had 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So I'm thrilled, you know, when we opened the London Research Center in 2022, our hope was that there was a next generation of scholars that were going to ask different questions than have been asked and pursue different avenues of research and study. And that is entirely what we have seen. We have been thoroughly validated that there is a younger generation that is asking very different questions. And you ask, what are we doing? You go, well, we're bringing interns from across the country, students from across the country, researchers from across the country, artists from across the country to engage with the story in a meaningful level. And in a way, similar to what the Taos Society of Artists did, bring it back out across the nation. And that's important because we are not teaching this history critically on a national level. And without that, we can't move through where we are today. Politicians are not going to save us. I'll stop there. Any other questions?
I'm pretty reluctant to ask this question, maybe naive or stupid question. No stupid questions. John was saying, really struck me when he said that tribal members making comments that hurt him about his art. And I was thinking, I've been thinking for years, how do the tribal members feel about other tribal members making art, you can live into art? And how do they feel about non-native people, especially Inuit people, making it look good in art? How do they feel?
Did you hear that, John? Yeah. So the question was, how do Native people feel about non-Native people making art about them today? You know, something years on.
Well, I think that's a form of flattery. I was just going to say something about, what would it be if there wasn't any interest in starting the interest of the art, you know, that keeps the book where we continuously mix our book, because of course they're coming in. So that forces us, in one degree, to keep our book the way it looks. So, you know, to one degree it helps. As to your question, it doesn't bother me. you know, how the other artists, non-native artists portray, as long as they're doing it in a respectful way. I've been posing quite a bit, you know, throughout my career as an artist. So I've been on the other end. In the beginning, I kind of felt odd, but I've come to learn these other artists when they come to Taos. But lately, and they understand what I am bound for them.
Do we know what Ben Lujan or Jerry Arabelle, Frank Zamora felt about painting models? Kushida, all the different people that were proposing to the TSA, do we have that anywhere in any tradition, any record?
Thankfully, we have a lot of material on Ben Lujan. If you're not familiar with Ben Lujan, he was Couse's favorite model. Starts modeling as a teenager. He was the same age as the Couse's only child, Kitty, so they grew up literally as blood brothers. And Ben did not have a strong nuclear family, so he really becomes partly adopted by the Couse family. It's a really fascinating dynamic. What's amazing is we do have letters that Ben wrote to the family. We have letters that Eliseo wrote to the family talking about his father. So we have an amazing amount of archival material. And Ben is an example of someone who was in control of his own narrative during his lifetime. He was very aware of his partnership with Couse and what they were doing. And he was also, he's still respected at the Pueblo today. When you talk about Ben Lujan, people's eyes light up and they talk about Ben. He remained integral to tribal leadership and religion while navigating a very challenging time in Pueblo history. So, you know, what we gather is that Ben was in some ways proud of the work that he was doing because he knew that he was sending Taos Pueblo out to the nation at a time where it was very easy to disregard indigenous communities because that's what we were doing. That was the basis of Manifest Destiny. These people weren't utilizing this land properly, so therefore they had no right to remain on that land because we as good Christians could make a better use of that land. So yeah, that's actually why we're working on a traveling exhibition that is devoted to Ben Lujan's story. Because it is a really powerful story. Okay, any other questions? Don't be shy. These guys can handle them. Okay, then I think we are good. Well, big round of applause for us. And thank you for all of you for joining us and spending this Saturday morning for what I think is an important conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.